Have you ever thought how fortunate Americans are that the world is learning their language? Many apologies to the Brits for that last statement. Up next on the Crossing Ideas podcast. Welcome to the Crossing Ideas podcast. I'm Mark Sasse, author of 12 novels, playwright fortunate enough to win some awards, and an American who has lived half his life internationally. I've decided to use these experiences in this podcast as a lens of looking at the world of today. I'd be grateful if you check out my work at www.mwsasse.com. That's MWSASSE.com. Episode 7, Language Learning, aka the day I ordered food successfully. Talk about privilege. I've traveled the world, and wherever I go, whether it's checking into a hotel in Bali or Kuala Lumpur, or eating at a restaurant in Jeddah, or talking to a taxi driver in Tbilisi, everyone is speaking English. Road signs, menus, subway signs, English, English, English. That makes the typical monolingual American pretty privileged when traveling. The world has literally opened its doors to its English-speaking population. One rather ironic exception was in Ireland. I was on a bus outside of Cork in southwestern Ireland in a little town that's spelled Calais, but they pronounced Killa. A local Irishman sat beside me on the bus, and he started talking to me, and I had no idea what he was saying. He kept going on, and eventually he got a little perturbed when all I did was smile and nod. I think he was expecting me to reciprocate a little bit, but I didn't know what he was saying. He then clammed up and never spoke another word to me. You know, when I got back to the place where I was staying, I asked the lady about this experience, and she said, don't worry, I can't understand them either. Okay, so besides Ireland, English is king. Not only king, it is seen as key to economic development. But even more than that, recently I was talking with a Saudi Arabian colleague, and he said, quote, Saudis don't want to admit that they don't know English because it is a sign of being Western educated, which is highly desirable. English in 2023 is still highly valued, which opens the door to the American traveler. Could this have led to the fact that Americans are terrible at language learning? And if we extrapolate language teaching? I suppose many had a similar experience that I had when I was learning a foreign language in school. I started taking French in junior high school. You know, German was the other option, and I should have taken German because their club sold the gummy bears, which were imported from Germany. This was well before gummies, as we would call them, were readily available in the US market. But alas, I chose French. I don't know why. And I took it for 5 years. I could conjugate a verb, but I couldn't communicate at all. Never went anywhere to use it except Mr. Report. He took us to a French restaurant on a field trip once, and I was thoroughly unimpressed. So in college, I took an additional 2 years of French. I got all A's and B's, but I couldn't communicate at all. All that wasted time for me to be able to say, Je ne parle pas français. If learning isn't practical, then what's the point? Vietnam changed everything for me as a language learner. Moving to Hai Phong, Vietnam in 1994, there were very few English speakers. We were tasked to teach English to sailors at the Maritime University. Now, some there knew it well. Most were limited, but they had a need. You know, the manuals and the international communication on the open seas were done in English. So they worked their tails off to learn, and we did our best to teach them. But out in the local Vietnamese community, it was rare to run into anyone who spoke English. And I didn't know Vietnamese at the time, so how will I survive by learning? And I would have to learn Vietnamese if I wanted to live there for any length of time. During my 10 years in Vietnam, I had three main language teachers. Mr. Tao was the first. We met randomly on the street. Well, I don't know if it was random. I think he saw a foreigner and he scooted towards me as quickly as possible, desperate to speak English. And I was surprised at how good his English was. He was a middle-aged man, and he was very meticulous about the way he spoke English. It was correct English. He had taught himself English and opened up a tiny little English language center to teach youngsters wanting to learn, and there were plenty. Hey, look at that budding entrepreneurship in the 1990s. I'm looking at you, episode 3. This teacher wanted to exchange lessons, so he would teach me Vietnamese. I would work with him in English. And it would be a great way for him to build his prestige as a teacher, to have a foreigner as a friend and a foreigner as a mentor in his language learning. And I became very good friends with their whole family, and their English ability literally changed their lives as they eventually all emigrated to Canada. After 3 years, I decided that I really wanted to learn the language well, if I planned to be there in Vietnam much longer. So I moved to Hanoi to study language full time. I had some vocab, quite a large amount of vocab, but I couldn't speak at the time, beyond, ordering food at the market and things like that. And I had trouble hearing the language because it's very difficult, 6 different tones. My first teacher in Hanoi, well, how do I say? He was awful. I spent the first couple lessons just repeating the same phrases over and over again. Phrases that I already knew, and it just came to me what one of those phrases were. It was baiser la maiser. And he just said, no, say it this way. Baiser la maiser, baiser la maiser. And I just sat across from him saying this phrase over and over. That phrase means, what time is it? Every time I was out in the community and I said that, people understood me. I had no problem. But for some reason, he thought my pronunciation was horrible, and we just went over and over and over that same phrase. And eventually, I knew exactly what time it was. It was time to get a new teacher. So I told the language center where I was learning that I wanted someone new. So in walked this young woman, Ko Hien. And I wanted to challenge myself. And so on day 1, I told Ko Hien, I never want her to speak to me in English. 100% Vietnamese. And we got to work. I studied for 3 hours, 4 days a week under Ko Hien. I added some tutors in the afternoons to help me practice what I learned. And the best part of all, when I went out into the community, I was immersed in Vietnamese culture and language. I was forced to use it in every possible way, completely different from any other language classes I've ever had in the past. My vocabulary exploded. Within a matter of months, I was fairly fluent. And that brings me to the day that I ordered food successfully. I can't even believe that food delivery was a thing in 1998 Hanoi, but you could call certain little restaurants and they would deliver it on their backs of their motorbikes. And that's what's happening today in Jeddah. I'm currently in Jeddah, and they're still doing that, delivering on motorbikes 25 years later. It's pretty wild. But one day I was alone in the office of our organization, and I wanted to order some food. I was nervous because, one, they had to understand me. I had to understand their reply. And then I had to order correctly. And then I also had to give the correct address. And this was over the phone where there's no body language cues that were going to help me. And so I remember I rehearsed this. I walked back and forth in the office, going over and over in my brain what I was going to say exactly. And I said it again and again until it flowed out of my mouth. And then I said, okay, I got to do this. So I dialed. I ordered, I hung up, and I remember I just let out this joyous yell like, whoa! And I started running around that office in delirium. I had successfully ordered food, and I gave directions to the house in Vietnamese. And 30 minutes later, the faith in my ability was rewarded when the food showed up at the correct location. It was a monumental day for my language learning. When stuff like that started to happen, I began to realize that I had to admit something to myself. I spoke Vietnamese. In the past, when I would meet someone, they would ask, "Do you speak Vietnamese?" And I would always reply the standard, "A little." "Will eat a little." I couldn't say that anymore. I had become a speaker of Vietnamese. I was fluent. I was bilingual for the first time ever. I had achieved what I should have achieved with 7 years of French lessons. No, I didn't know everything, far from it, but I could navigate nearly most situations with some degree of fluency. The time with Ko Hien gave me the fluency and vocabulary level that I needed for my final Vietnamese teacher, Mr. Khoi, Tay Khoi. Now, he is a man highly respected and incredibly educated. He didn't speak English, but I had the privilege of learning Vietnamese history and culture under his supervision. And another way that language just opened the door for me, because I never would have been able to learn from him if I hadn't learned the language first. So Tay Khoi's, his father was actually a contemporary of Ho Chi Minh, and his father was the first education secretary for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam back in the 1940s. Now, he wasn't a communist, and I actually referenced him in episode 1 of the podcast, but his father also was a signer of that Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. So he was literally one of modern Vietnam's founding fathers, you could say. And if you go to Hanoi now, the northern end of Hoan Kim Lake, there's Hang Ngang Street, and there's the place where Ho Chi Minh wrote the Declaration of Independence. And there's a photograph of Uncle Ho there with Tay Khoi's father and other cabinet members. I mean, it's pretty cool stuff. And so I got to learn a lot about that era through my teacher. And I worked on a variety of different topics with Tay Khoi. Now, there was one in particular which was very challenging. There's a Cornell professor, Keith Taylor, who was a scholar of Vietnam. He wrote the classic work, The Birth of Vietnam. And Tay Khoi loved that book, and he wanted me to translate the introduction of that book and then have it published into the Vietnamese magazine Ngày Xưa, which literally means, the past, history, basically, the past. And so I started working on this. And so I would do a translation, go line by line, and then Tay Khoi would come back over the lines and correct my grammar, maybe add in some other vocabulary I didn't know, and just make it sound more academic. And this was, it was academic Vietnamese, which is different than buying chicken in the market. It was very challenging, but eventually it got published. And so my name is written as the translator in the issue of Ngày Xưa, circa 1999 or so, thanks to Tay Khoi, which is a pretty cool accomplishment. That time with him really opened a fire within me to learn more about Vietnamese culture and history. And this eventually led me into doing training on Vietnamese culture and Vietnamese history, and eventually led me to actually teaching history, completing my master's degree in humanities with a history concentration, because I just couldn't get enough. So it really took me in a completely different direction I had not anticipated in my life. Learning a second language opens so many doors to experiences I never would have had. Meeting people that I never would have met, learning their stories that I never would have known. This makes me think of probably my favorite language exchange of all time. There were 4 of us in this meeting at the university when I was in Thanh Nguyen. There was me, a woman named Joanne from our organization who had traveled down from China. There was Chi Lien. Chi Lien, I talked about her in previous episodes, and the president of the university. The 4 of us had this very, very interesting language exchange. When I would be talking with Joanne, we would talk in English. And Joanne also spoke with Chi Lien in English. But when Joanne spoke with the president of the university, who didn't know English, she spoke to him in Chinese, because he knew Chinese. And I spoke to the president in Vietnamese. And then when the president of the university was speaking with Chi Lien, they spoke in Russian. So we had this cross exchange of English going this way and Vietnamese going this way and Chinese going this way and Russian going that way. It was fabulous. It was so wonderful. And it took 4 languages for all of us to be able to say everything that we wanted to say to each other. Because sometimes, they wanted to say things that we couldn't understand and vice versa and things like that. It was a fantastic experience and one of my favorites of all time. Language is meant to communicate the human soul. Not only do I fear that we have become not great at learning second languages, I also think that we have really dumbed down our first language. Case in point, I want you to listen to this. This was written in 1862 by a young private in the Union Army. Just listen to this. Under the dark shade of a towering oak near the Dunkard Church lay the lifeless form of a drummer boy, apparently not more than 17 years of age. Flaxen hair and eyes of blue and form of delicate mold. As I approached him, I stooped down, and as I did so, I perceived a bloody mark upon his forehead. It showed where the leaden messenger of death had produced the wound that caused his death. His lips were compressed, his eyes half open. A bright smile played upon his countenance. By his side lay his tenor drum, never to be tapped again. Wow. This was written by Private J.D. Hicks from the 125th Pennsylvania Volunteers. This was not an educated, highly educated person. This was a young boy. He was not a writer. He was a private in the Army, and that's the way he used the language in 1862. My, oh my, how our society has devolved since then. Think about the language of today. Who can write something like that today? Do you think a typical 18 and 19-year-old can write something like that? Not likely. And we see it from the ridiculousness of TikTok to the instant messages, the LOLs, the emojis. I sometimes look at my students, I have no idea what they're even trying to say. And then when they write a paragraph, I wonder if they even know what the word punctuation means or capitalization, let alone the vocabulary that they're using. And this is their first language, let alone the second one that they might be learning. Besides the dumbing down of language, we've been scrubbing our language, or at least attempting to, scrubbing it of things we deem offensive. Boy, I shouldn't get started on this one because it's a real pet peeve of mine. The idea of changing language to suit modern ideology. Language is always changing. That's a fact. But this is purposeful, methodical change driven by ideology. This is George Orwell's 1984 type of stuff. Recently, they started rewriting books because of the offensive language. Roald Dahl, his books have been rewritten. Dr. Seuss, some of his books have been banned or not going to be published anymore because of the words that are in them. That there are words that the New York Times has said they will no longer use in their crossword puzzles. I have the same stance on language as I have on historical statues that you think might poorly represent the past. Don't tear them down. Talk about them. Instruct. Don't destroy. Let's read Huckleberry Finn in all its glory and talk about why the language was written in that way and at that time. Before I get way off topic, let me get back to Vietnam. Vietnamese opened me up to a brand new world of language and communication, while my own language has been methodically under attack. The best language teachers spur you on to other things, because language opens the doors to the universe. If you are just learning language for head knowledge, then maybe it will help you on a crossword puzzle or a bit of trivia at a house party. But language learning was meant for so much more. I feel privileged to have been able to have the time and support to study Vietnamese, and in some ways change the direction of my entire life because of it. Learn a language. Learn to build bridges into the world around you. It's made a dramatic difference in my life. And I just want to officially thank those 3 Vietnamese teachers of mine who poured many, many hours into me. Thank you. You have made a difference. This is Mark Sasse for the Crossing Ideas podcast. Up next in episode 8, A Charlie Brown Christmas in Vietnam. Remember to subscribe to receive all future episodes. And once again, thanks for listening.